Excerpts from the book Indians of Skagit County, Part 1, General History by Chief Martin J. Sampson. Part of the Skagit County Historical Series, published by Skagit County Historical Society. Note: some terminology has been adjusted in this project to aptly reflect contemporary cultural inclusivity and diversity. For more information on this topic, contact Skagit County Historical Museum.
Letter from Vi Hilbert, Skagit Elder and Director of Lashutseed Research, May 2nd, 1998. Indians of Skagit County is a publication that has filled the void that has existed concerning the first people of this land. Martin's information is the first voice of the first people to educate the public in printed form. He is following instructions from his mother and our ancestors to educate those who had not benefited from traditional teachers. His information was from the inside, a book coming from the voice of the culture itself and not from an outsider. Even going against the criticism of their time, some of these historians allowed their memories to be audio taped. These historians were honored for their gift of memories. They had been instructed by their families that this is a responsibility earned by each of us who inherit the tradition of historian for our people, for our culture. They were ahead of their time in trusting technology to bring their voices to the future. Thank you for listening traditionally. Forward. Indians of Skagit County by Chief Martin J. Sampson was first published in 1972 and is thought to be the first such book written by a Pacific Northwest Indian. Chief Sampson captures the complex cultures of the various tribes, bands, and clans who lived in Skagit County for millennia prior to the arrival of the first white people. It is not intended to be an academic history. It is an historical reminiscence that captures the stories and culture as reflected in Chief Sampson's life experiences and in the stories passed to him by tribal elders. Its significance is found in the way it captures this era, complete with the language, biases, and conflicts of its time. Indians of Skagit County will always be an important primary source, written by a tribal elder, and is not the endpoint of understanding, but a good starting point, which will always be part of our history. Jesse G. Kennedy III, Ph.D. Member, Skagit County Historical Society, Publications Committee 2014.
Though there are plausible theories, no one knows for sure whence the native people came. But the mythology and legends which have been told by father to son through many generations claim that the natives and all living things, animals, birds, trees, etc., stemmed from the same source and at one time had a common language and aided one another in their struggle for a primitive existence.
The first white settlers never saw the indigenous people at their full numbers and the peak of their culture. What they found was the broken remnant of a once powerful people, reduced to this state by disease, the white man's first gift to the natives, carried to them by the early explorers and traders. The appalling toll reached almost 100% in some villages, leaving not enough people to bury the dead. Journals of fur men note the many deserted villages along the Columbia and the demoralized condition of the few dazed survivors. Similar conditions existed in Skagit County. Though the story was not recorded on paper, it was handed down by word of mouth and gives a picture of the catastrophe that befell the natives between 1830 to 1835, before the first white settlers came. What the pioneers met was a people trying to recover from a devastating blow. Indigenous peoples' history is based on the family history of chiefs and on legends and mythology, and the time of events is referred to by generations. The general history need not go any further back than 3 or 4 generations before the Point Elliott-Mukilteo Treaty of January 22nd, 1855. Since all the indigenous people of Skagit County were living in the territory involved in the treaty, it follows that the recorded history of local natives began with this treaty. The background of the written history is the story of the chiefs who were here 3 or 4 generations before the treaty, an account transmitted verbally within each tribe or band.
There were 11 tribes and bands who had their main homes in what is now Skagit County. The Skagit tribe of Whidbey also had a fishing village situated about 1 mile above the North Fork of the Skagit River, their only holding in Skagit County. The domains of these 11 tribes extended into the surrounding counties of Island, Snohomish, Whatcom, and San Juan.
These 11 bands numbered perhaps 1,000, which is just a guess as there was no accurate record made before or at the time of the treaty. The minutes of the treaty record 2,300 at the meeting and estimate 700 men, women, and children who did not attend, but many representatives of tribes other than Skagit County natives attended the treaty meeting. The numbers recorded did not include the Nooksacks. At the time of the meeting, the Nooksack River was frozen over, making it impossible for the people to come down the river in their canoes. Canoes propelled by paddles were the only means of transportation that the indigenous people had before the coming of the Europeans. All river natives used the shovel-nose dugouts, hollowed-out cedar logs by master artisans. Many of these canoes were 50 feet long and 5 feet wide, and all were of striking design and symmetry.
The language spoken by 10 of the tribes is known as Skagit or Lushootseed. These tribes and bands have different words and names for certain things, and an accent peculiar to their particular band, just like Northern, Southern, and Western Americans speak different versions of the English language.
In addition to their tribal language, many coast natives also spoke the Chinook jargon, a trade language developed long before the coming of the white man, which enabled them to communicate with other tribes speaking a different tongue. Anthropologists have cataloged all of the 11 tribes of Skagit County as Salish, along with Lummi and Samish tribes, who once owned and occupied the San Juan Islands.
The Life of Vi Hilbert, found on historylink.org. Essay 7130 by Janet Yoder, posted November 29, 2004. Vi Hilbert, a member of the Upper Skagit tribe, had as her life's work to preserve the Lushootseed Puget Salish language and culture. Vi learned Lushootseed, the language of Chief Seattle, as a child, listening to her parents. This recollected knowledge allowed her to help the linguist Thomas Hess transcribe and translate early Lushootseed recordings of elders, including Vi's parents. With delight, Vi quickly learned to read and write this oral language. She went on to teach the Lushootseed language and literature, traditional stories, at the University of Washington. She co-wrote Lushootseed grammars and dictionaries and published books of stories, teachings, and place names. Vi taught hundreds of students, inspiring a few to become Lushootseed teachers and others to support and further her work. She generously shared Lushootseed language, stories, and traditions with organizations such as the Burke Museum, the Seattle Art Museum, United Indians of All Tribes, Tillicum Village, Seattle Storytellers Guild, and the National Storytelling Association. Vi brought out Lushootseed with every audience she addressed, especially traditional gatherings, so that this ancient language can be heard throughout Puget Sound, where it has been spoken for centuries. Vi Hilbert passed away at her home in La Conner on the morning of December 19, 2008.
Indigenous people of Skagit County lived in villages for mutual security. Along the saltwater areas, the people dwelt where there was fresh water, building their permanent houses near the larger creeks. The houses had the general outlines of our modern ones, with straight walls and gable roofs. Posts and cross timbers were of logs. Plates, rafters, and sills were of cedar poles. The roof and walls were made of split cedar planks, as were the benches around the inside walls of the house. Benches served a double purpose, used for beds and seats.
In this all-cedar house, open fireplaces were placed in the middle with openings on the roof for the smoke to escape. Many of these dwellings were built large enough to accommodate several families. In fact, remains of a few of these houses have been found that measured 1,000 feet in length. Temporary houses on food gathering expeditions away from the village were constructed of poles covered with cattail mats. The primitive tools were skillfully fashioned from material at hand, including stone, horn, and hard wood. Bows were made of hardwood and arrows of cedar or other straight wood tipped with bone or stone heads. Native spears were straight cedar shafts tipped with hardwood.
Puget Sound natives were second to none in basket-making skills and design. The basket was all important in everyday life, since it was their carrying receptacle. There were big baskets for backpacking, the tightly woven ones for water and cooking. There were berry baskets, coarsely woven ones for carrying clams and other types. Many different fibers were used in the manufacturing of baskets, such as long, slender, whip-like roots, grasses, cattails, and the inner bark of cedar trees furnishing the major part of the material. Willow bark and their slender willow twigs were also used. For tying purposes, a tough, durable cord was fabricated from the bark of the wild cherry tree. Native-made dyes of sharply contrasting colors were used to bring out eye-catching designs. The art of making and using these dyes has gone largely into disuse now, but the older people will always remember the beautiful native baskets of yesterday. Basketry and the weaving of the useful cattail mats occupied much of the Indigenous housewife's time. Shredded cedar bark, along with the skins and furs of animals, played an important part in the fabrication of clothing. Mountain goat wool was used for clothing and for blankets, since the Northwest natives were one of the few, if not the only, indigenous people who understood the art of weaving before the white man came. One unusual source of wool was a special breed of dogs, unknown elsewhere, raised for their fleece.
Fiber nets and spears were used to catch fish, and clever traps were used along the riverbanks and across creeks for the same purpose. Fish, especially salmon, was the mainstay of life and was dried and smoked in huge quantities and stored for the lean times. Without this important food asset, there would have been hunger at times when hunting conditions were not good.
The Indigenous people of Skagit County, in common with other Puget Sound tribes, were the most fortunate natives in the United States regarding food resources. The forests teemed with game: deer, bear, elk, grouse, and goats in the high mountains. Berries of many kinds grew in profusion and were dried and stored for winter use. Roots of the camas, fern, cattail, skunk cabbage, and other plants were dug and eaten fresh or dried and stored for future consumption. Certain of these roots were ground and used as flour.
Along the waterfronts were millions of ducks and an endless supply of delicious clams, native oysters, crabs, various kinds of fish in untold numbers, of which salmon was king. Fish oil, rendered and stored in large quantities, was also an important item in the Indians' larder, serving many purposes. It was butter, dressings for salads or for dried berries and dried fish, skin conditioner, and a valuable article in trade, owing to its many uses. Another proved commodity was grease derived from bear fat. Outside of sickness or unusually inclement weather, there was little excuse for Puget Sound Indians going hungry.
Cooking was accomplished by 3 methods: broiling by threading fish or meat on sticks and exposing to the fire, baking in hot ashes or hot rocks with perhaps a layer of seaweed added to induce steaming, and boiling in watertight baskets or wooden baskets containing water into which hot rocks were dropped until the meat became tender. Frying was unknown until the white man came. Experts have said that the coast natives, while cooking the indigenous way, had a diet superior in vitamins to that which we enjoy today.
Before the advent of the white man, much trade was carried on among the various tribes, with large numbers of people often traveling great distances in their seagoing canoes on trading expeditions. Business was carried on mostly by barter, but there was one medium of exchange which passed as cash and would buy anything up and down the Northwest Coast and Puget Sound: shell money. This legal tender was the slender tube-like dentalium shell, strung on cords with a certain number of value to its length. This precious shell only grew in the waters of the west coast of Vancouver Island. Its value continued for some time after the first white traders came, but now specimens are only seen in museums.
Indigenous people of Skagit County were not warlike people in the sense that some plains people were, but they did occasionally make war on their enemies, most often as a retaliatory action against the slave-raiding tribes from British Columbia, against whom they were in a constant state of defense. Heads were taken as trophies, villages were burned, and captives became slaves of the victors. Warlike activity since the coming of the pioneers has consisted mostly of small-scale feuds among local bands. War scares, experienced by the early white settlers of Skagit County, were usually the result of wild rumors. It is recorded, however, that troops were sent up the Skagit River in 1881 when the untreated Indigenous people resisted surveyors laying out lands that the local natives felt had not been fairly acquired. But the matter was settled, and to the natives' disadvantage.
Each of the tribes had a territory which they owned, controlled, and governed by a chief, sub-chiefs, and headmen in a council. Each tribe respected the holdings and rights of the owners. The general council of the tribe was open to all members, including women. However, the decisions on tribal matters were left to the chiefs and the council. Except in times of emergency, tribal organization was rather loose and tribal boundaries flexible according to the needs of the inhabitants. But these people were definitely organized.
Indigenous people were self-sustaining. Their religion was multiple spiritism. Each person had one or more spirit guides or guardians. These were inherited or acquired by fasting and bathing in clean and secluded places. The natives believed in the hereafter, that death was not the end, but the beginning of a new life, and the spirit of man advanced from one world to another, and that the wicked lingered on this earth for a long time before advancing to the next spirit world. The dead were placed on racks or in canoes and hung on trees in order to keep wild animals from carrying away the bodies. This was referred to as aerial burials. Burial in the ground came after the teachings of Christianity and the availability of picks and shovels. Babies were cared for in the traditional native cradle boards, and in the days of aerial burials, these boards often served as coffins for the departed infants. Marriage was arranged by parents or guardians. Intertribal marriages were encouraged. Slavery existed, and polygamy was permitted. Buying the bride was a surety, a bond of good faith, and in due time the purchase price might be returned in goods of equal value. Worthy men were sought after, and it was common practice to give them brides. Some men had as many as 10 wives. Despite early laws forbidding interracial marriages, most of the unions between white men and Native women were successful. The successful marriages were a credit to good quality people, substantial citizens of the country who paved the way for others to bring their families to the western frontier. Through all Indigenous beliefs ran a strong thread of conservation. It was considered right and proper to take animals and fish for food and clothing, but never to kill them for the sport of it, or to waste the resources put on earth for man's use. To do so would incur the wrath of the gods.